It says we are live. Yeah. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first session that is more dedicated to teachers, where we'll be talking about how to create a multilingual library, especially multilingual libraries of picture books. And so when we think of raising multiliterate children, we immediately think of a library and full of books written in all of our children's languages. And at a personal level, I see with my sons how it has helped them develop their language, having all these books in different languages at an easy reach. It developed their fluency as well. So it's been very beneficial. But already as a family, we encountered two main challenges, which is finding books in Korean, because in our family we have Korean and French as home languages. French is easy to get, but Korean is a lot more difficult, and also the cost it involves. And I've heard that from schools, there are even more things to take into consideration, especially when you don't speak all the languages of your students. So today we have Hannah King with us to discuss about this very important topic of how to build a multilingual library in a school. But I'm sure parents as well will get a lot from this session. And so before we start with the questions, I hope it's okay if I introduce you to our audience.
Please.
So Hannah King is a senior lecturer in English language at London Metropolitan University and a PhD candidate in Applied Linguistics at Birkbeck University of London. She holds an MA in cross-cultural communication and applied linguistics from Newcastle University and a BA in French and Spanish languages and literature from Western Washington University. And as a sociolinguist, her main research interests includes interactional and discursive identities, transactional language practices, and multilingualism. And in 2022-2023, she worked on a project funded by the British Association of Applied Linguistics that's entitled Promoting Multilingualism at School. And through the development of this project that explored how languages are made visible, represented, and valued in a linguistically and culturally diverse primary school, Hannah led on the creation of a multilingual library of picture books that now counts 261 books in more than 62 languages, I believe. So that's impressive. And so I'm really pleased to welcome Hannah King to this interview.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for this welcome. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. So, first of all, can you explain a bit more about the topic of your research and what led you to look into multilingual libraries in particular?
Absolutely. So I'll start with the project actually that Yoshito just mentioned. We partnered with an East London primary school that is particularly linguistically and culturally diverse. And actually they were seeking, as a school that was already engaging with their multilingualism, they were kind of seeking a partnership with a university to help understand the kind of research implications of multilingualism and what they were doing. And so we started working together on this wider project that Yoshito mentioned called Promoting Multilingualism at School. And the subheading for that was how researcher and practitioner collaboration can support and inform the educator-student community triad. So we wanted to consider all of those different stakeholders in this project. So as researchers, we were quite interested in exploring how the school itself was responding to the multilingual reality of their teaching context. Now, as part of the student aspect, how we would connect with the students at the school, my colleague and I were brainstorming about how we might engage with the students in the school in a meaningful way. And actually, the idea came because I had heard about and encountered a story of Colombia's Biblioburro. So I don't know if any of you have heard of this. It's sometimes called the Donkey Library of Colombia. But essentially, there's a librarian teacher, Luis Soriano, who recognized that in rural parts of Colombia, children were not getting access to books. So he started traveling with his two donkeys, which he named Alpha and Beto, so alphabet if you put that together. And he started taking books around to the kids. So
Oh,
this kind of struck a chord with me. I love this idea about, especially this idea of a traveling library. Unfortunately, we're not really allowed to have a donkey in London. However, it was that idea that kind of stuck with me. So the conceptualization was that we would put together this multilingual library in collaboration with this particular primary school, but actually that it would eventually sit with us more widely as researchers. So it could travel with us, however metaphorically.
yeah,
So we could then explore that wider impact we could have partnering with public libraries, for example, or other primary schools or other types of schools. We've since even done a pop-up multilingual library in our university. So thinking about how we can also reach university students. And of course, for research purposes, to better understand multilingual literacy and how multilingual books impact on these types of settings. I realize that I'm kind of throwing around the word multilingual, so I better just mention that,
yeah,
particularly when it comes to this multilingual library, we've used a very inclusive definition, right? That could include not just different languages, but also different language varieties, different registers. And our library is a collection of all different kinds of books. So those could be single language books. I just have a couple here. So single language books. So here's a book in Spanish, for example. We have here a book in Korean, right? So a single language book. These two also happen to be written this is the original language they were written in, right? So written by Korean authors or written by Spanish-speaking authors. We also have some translated books. So translated books can, for example, think of Julia Donaldson, right? You see her books everywhere in the UK, so you can sometimes find her books translated to other languages.
yeah.
We also find some books about mixing, right? So books that incorporate more than one language into their storytelling.
Ah,
We even have a book also about Filipino Sign Language, for example, that brings in that element of language. So I just want to mention that throughout this chat, as we talk about the word multilingual, I'm thinking of that in a very inclusive way.
yeah,
And it doesn't mean that a book has to have many languages. It means that the library can house books that have any kind of language or language variety inside them.
yeah. But I really like this inclusive understanding of what multilingualism is because it also echoes the variety of multilingual people there are in the world. And so just as well, because we're talking about the books you have presented, we have loads of books in the program of the event that you can find in various languages. So if you want to have a look, you can go there. And second thing I wanted to mention is that you worked with a particular school in London, which is so one of our speakers, which will come on Sunday morning, 10:15 to 11:15 UK time, is
Mhm.
Sufia Amin.
Yeah.
And so she's the assistant head teacher. She included multilingualism as part of her school, and you collaborated. So maybe we hear from your work, the impact that your work has had onto her
Mhm.
children. So make sure to tune in on Sunday morning as well.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned that. It's been such a privilege to work together, not only with Sofia Amin, but my colleague Gonzalo Perez Andrade, who was also co-leading on this project with me. And I think that that's actually an important thing to think about, at least in terms of our work with that particular school, is there was a lot of support already in place for multilingualism and for developing this kind of program. And so it's something to bear in mind. I think that you might have a more challenging route to creating a multilingual library or to creating a more inclusive, school for multilingualism if you already have a little bit of reluctance in that community towards the languages
Yeah.
present. So in that sense, we were quite privileged to kind of go along and observe what's already happening here, where so much is going on in terms of inclusivity and, linguistic and cultural diversity.
Yeah, because it's not because there is cultural diversity or linguistic diversity in the school. So maybe students could speak lots of different languages, that the school itself or the ethos or the mindset is ready for multilingual libraries or to see languages more like visually and more present in the school. So I guess that's a first step, but I guess as well, having this idea of multilingual library can also help this transition as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think so.
And so when you started your research, I guess you had some hypotheses. And can you explain what they were and if you could verify them through your observations or not? And did you discover that you were something that you were not expected?
Sure. Yeah. So, starting out, I think we had some general ideas, right? We were interested in representation. We're
Yeah,
interested in identity and making visible these kind of minority languages starting out in the school space, but also, we'd like to do that more widely. So that was something that we had hoped to do, right? And in some ways, I had felt certainly that bringing in multilingual books, giving the kids, the students, something physical in print, and we'll talk a bit about, I'll mention later some digital options. So not to say that it's necessarily a hierarchy, but I think that there's value in holding a book in your hands, and seeing,
yeah,
here is my language in print, right? So I bought this book. This is in Plains Cree, so a Native American language. And I think particularly languages that are not often seen in print, the fact of just
yeah,
having them can make a big difference. So I think that
yeah,
certainly I had hoped and thought that there could be some positive impacts on this idea of making the languages more visible, helping the students feel more represented, and that, of course, links to their identities.
yeah,
Um, we also wanted to kind of counter these deficit views of English as an additional language. So often, EAL students, as they're called, are kind of positioned as not having English, right? Or not having enough
yeah,
English, or their English isn't good enough.
yeah,
And so we want to flip that narrative, and we want to say, okay, but actually, these are multilingual learners. These are students who are coming to the table with their own languages and cultures and language and cultural knowledge, that they can add English to that, right? So I think that's one thing that we wanted to explore.
yeah,
But we do know from other research, right, that actually visibility does help speakers to see their languages as normal. So that's something that we had expected, is maybe to kind of normalize the idea of seeing other languages that aren't English. Um,
yeah,
as well as English. Of course, we have English books in our library. Picture books have also, there's research that shows that they can counter social inequities, making them a potential tool for social justice. They've been used in inclusive pedagogy. So there is research to support these ideas that creating this multilingual library could have a real impact. Um, so in terms of what we've observed, so we will of course be continuing to write about this and publish about this, but so far some of the observations that we have noticed, first is just a general sense of excitement and interest. I think the kids were not only excited to see the books, but excited to see us, and they would see us and say hola, or whatever whatever hello in whichever languages, because they started to kind of associate us as these kind of outside visitors, as these multilingual people. So they wanted to kind of show off their
yeah,
languages, right? But that already takes you to a place where kids are starting to feel that their language is valued, that somebody is going to ask them which languages do they speak, and explore that
yeah,
with them. We've also seen children claiming their languages, and I would say sometimes claiming languages that maybe they don't have a lot of knowledge of, but that's fine too.
yeah,
One child who speaks Turkish at home, I asked him one time which languages he speaks, and I think he told me about 5 different languages, including Spanish, and I'm sure he knows a few words of Spanish, but he had a friend that speaks Spanish. So it was also this sense of seeing the kids kind of take on their friends' languages, ask their friends, learning how to greet each other in their friends' languages and their peers' languages. And then the students wanting to share these things. So one aspect of our multilingual library was actually to organize a multilingual story time. So this was a
mhm,
way that we could actually use the books
yeah,
in a proactive way. And so this was an after-school literacy program in a sense. So we brought volunteers from our university to come and read with the kids. And after we had done that, one thing that was observed, for example, was a child who had been in our multilingual story time, then inviting, she was an older student in the primary school, inviting the little kids to come, sit with her in their multilingual library at lunchtime, and she wanted to read to them,
Ah,
you know.
nice.
And I heard the little kids lost patience and ran off to play at some point, but it's nice, she learned from us that this idea of kind of reading together, reading in community, sharing the multilingual library with others. And so she was kind of paying that forward, I guess.
Yeah,
Um, you asked, I think, also about things that we might have discovered that we weren't
yeah.
expecting. Um, I guess I don't know, I hadn't really thought about what would happen in terms of students who weren't already engaging in their multilingualism. So for example, there was a student who had I think it was an English mom and a Greek dad. And we were told that actually they had had little previous interest in learning Greek, right? They're growing up here in the
Ah,
UK, and
nice.
English was very much the priority, and the child was therefore not keen, right, to learn this heritage language. However, after we started working on this project and we started having the multilingual library, the multilingual story time, we found out that she told her parents, so actually I do want to learn Greek, right?
Ah,
So that
that's
was kind
great.
of a nice feeling, because I think you can actually probably tell us more about this as a parent of multilingual children, that you can't force kids. You don't want to force kids, right? You want to find a way to generate that interest.
Yeah,
And if it comes from them, then it's not only kind of think more authentic, but I think it's likely to be more long lasting, right? If the
yeah,
children are yeah, actively kind of engaging in their own language learning experience.
yeah. And then we're just here to facilitate it and to help them access the book, speaking more the language, etc. And
Mm-hmm.
I think like just to come back on one thing you said earlier about having physical books, I think it's really powerful to have to literally making some space for the language, so in the library, etc. But to so having it digitally, it's like you can't really touch it, or it's there, but if you swipe it, you get to another language, etc. So it's not really present, but if you have the book in your hands, it's really there. There's a physical presence. I
Yeah.
give that, I guess that gives a sense of just legitimacy,
Legitimacy,
the
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. And
to
I
the
think that
language.
it makes it tangible in some sense as well, because you think about a school setting in the UK. You do
Mhm.
have books. You have a lot of books and print materials, right?
Yeah,
So those print materials are valued, but they
yeah,
are in English. So, if what we're showing is, okay, yes, we have a library space, but the only books worth putting in it, are the ones that are published in the English language, then that's a message in and of itself. So I do
yeah,
genuinely think that the existence of a multilingual
yeah,
library, however tiny, and that's something we'll talk about, it doesn't have to take, a huge effort. It doesn't have to be this giant project. It can start with just one book, right? Just adding one book to that collection, or asking the students to add books to the
yeah,
collection. So yeah, I'm sure that we'll talk a bit more about that as we go forward.
yeah.
Mm.
Thank you. And so you talked about a lot of impact it had on multilingual children and those who are reclaiming their languages.
Mhm.
Have you seen any impact on monolingual students? Maybe did they feel like they were left out, or was it positive and they wanted to learn maybe other languages? What was the impact on the monolingual students?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a very important question, actually, and perhaps one that we first overlooked a little bit as researchers because of the kind of buzz of multilingualism in the
Yeah.
space. It's actually now something that my colleague Gonzalo Perez Andrade that I mentioned and I have written about. So we've recently published a paper on this, about it's really about the labeling practices that we have, and how we might label students as EAL, multilingual, etc.
Mm.
However, in doing so, we took this reflexive approach where we wanted to consider our own positionality here, in this space as researchers. And what we discovered was a kind of hidden, although actually it wasn't very hidden, we just hadn't really noticed, but that the whole project had a very kind of pro multilingualism agenda. Um, as a lot of the programming that we're doing these days does. And not to say that that's a problematic thing. However, it's worth interrogating a little bit the kinds of messages that you can be sending. So what prompted me to reflect on this is actually that I had a moment when I realized that some of the students who were being invited to participate in multilingual story time
Mm.
were the kids who we already knew were multilingual, right? And this wasn't something that
Okay.
we were deciding as researchers. The school was taking the lead on this. So, but I think what was happening is that you would suggest to a child that you knew also spoke in Bengali at home, you'd say,
Uh,
hey, we have a multilingual story time, you should sign up. And since, of course, there was a limited number of spaces for kids, we
uh,
can't have everyone in the whole school at once. I think that probably there was a bit of prioritizing those students who we knew to be multilingual. What I
yeah.
realized later is actually in naming the program Multilingual Story Time, that could actually exclude those who don't identify as multilingual, those who feel, I speak only English, for example. And
Yeah.
even though I have, as a researcher, a very open idea of what multilingual means, so I include pretty much everybody in my definition, right? It's a very inclusive definition of multilingual. But when people identify as monolingual and they see a program advertised as multilingual story time, they might not feel as welcome in that space.
Yeah.
So, of course, they are. English is a language too. We have books in English, and English is one of the languages that we all kind of have in common. And if a child prefers to read in English at multilingual story time, great. There weren't rules around that. But I
Yeah.
think that sometimes, yes, how we name things and also who we think of right away to invite could have an impact there. Um, Now, that said, I absolutely think that there can be a positive impact on monolingual children as well. I think that being exposed to linguistic and cultural diversity can only just help to kind of broaden people's worldviews and the way that they, um, yeah, the way that they can imagine a world beyond their own. So I think that, yeah, that was something that I think it's very important that we have now, begun to reflect on. Um, I think that those of us who are working in these types of schools yeah, do need to be a little bit careful not to accidentally alienate those who might not identify, as I say, with
Yeah.
multilingualism. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think that that's important to clarify because some schools might feel like we have 90% of our students who speak another language at home, but what about these 10%? Are they out or
Mhm.
joining? And yeah, so it's good to clarify.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and now I would like to talk about more the challenges of building a multilingual library. So I talked earlier about me, so us as a family, there is the financial cost, the trying to find the books that interest our sons. What are the other challenges you have when you build a multilingual library? So for a school,
Mhm.
yeah. So except these two, and how do you go about it to overcome them?
Sure, yeah. So I guess we can just talk through a few potential challenges and some ways to overcome them. So I think finances is always one of the first things that people mention when we discuss
Mm.
this topic. But I think that try to start small, right? This idea that something is better than nothing. So even when we first proposed this project and we did have a bit of research funding, we proposed that we would get 20 books, right? And that we had calculated that based on the fact that we thought, okay, if we buy, for example, this is a brand new hardback book in English, my mother tongue's a very interesting book, talking about languages, right? So
Yeah,
in English, but still kind of on theme here. So if you're going to buy a book like this, but outside of the UK, right? So if this one inside the UK, you're going to spend 12.99. It says here on the back, right? Brand new. But if you buy a brand new hardback and you want to have it shipped even just from Europe, you're looking at,
yeah,
20 pounds by the time you get it here. If you want to have it shipped from further, you're looking at more. You mentioned your struggle sometimes with getting books in Korean. You're going to pay more for the shipping than you are going to pay
mm,
for the book itself, which can
yeah,
be frustrating. So I guess in that case, it's good to bundle books together if
yeah.
you can buy more than one at once.
That's
But
what we do.
Yeah, that was also a tip that you and I talked about, and then when I made a purchase of books in Korean, I did the same thing. I think I bought five, but the shipping was still more than a book,
Yeah,
and so, but yes, coming back to this idea of start small, right? So you don't need to move mountains here. Something is better than nothing.
yeah,
If you live in London, even if you live outside of London, of course, but there are fewer options perhaps, but I would say check out your local charity shops,
mhm,
particularly in parts of your city or parts of your country where there might be a bit more linguistic and cultural diversity. Because actually, I learned from a friend who was mothering in Polish, and she told me, actually, she was the one who told me, there's a really great, children's used bookstore. And she said, and they have a whole big section in other languages. And I thought, really? Oh, okay. So that ended up being a bit of a gold mine actually for this particular project, because if you're able to buy essentially brand new hardback picture books for you know 3-4 pounds,
yeah,
then
yeah,
that cuts everything. Yeah, all your prices go down, and that's very exciting. You can also ask for donations, and I know that sometimes in a school setting, people have asked parents, for example, to bring in books. If you have a fairly mobile community, which a lot of us do, with the kids and the parents maybe traveling back and forth to visit family, you can ask people, hey, can you bring us back some books, when you're next traveling in Turkey or whatever it is.
yeah,
The caveat with that is you don't know what you're going to get, right? And there's varying, qualities in terms of kind of physical qualities of books.
yeah,
There's also varying quality in terms of content and questions about what kind of content you want versus maybe what the parent wants. So donations are a great
true.
place to start. But what I've done when I take donations is I say, okay, I would love your donations as long as you're happy if I basically donate them on if they're not right for this library, for example, because I didn't want to get in a position of,
Yeah,
somebody donates something and they're very keen to see it in the library, but it doesn't go with whatever ethos of whatever it is that you're working on. So that's my recent caveat. When friends of friends have said, I'd love to give you some books, I say, great, but just so they know, like if it's not, because in our case, we have a multilingual library of picture books, right?
yeah,
So if donates books to us. For example, I've got quite a few books now in Turkish and some other languages that aren't necessarily picture books. So I won't put them in our library, but I'll keep an eye out for schools who might want to use them or parents who might want to use
yeah,
them, and I will pass them on, right? Finances as well. I think we talked about this briefly, but I think that make space for the books and for reading and for multilingual libraries in the school.
yeah,
One big impact that this project has had, I think perhaps even the most important impact, is that when we ended the project, even though we're continuing to collaborate, but when the project officially ended, our multilingual library came back to live with us as researchers. And the
yeah,
very exciting aspect of that is the school then created their own multilingual library. So because they had made that space for books and reading, as that became more central to the ethos of their school, they were able to leverage that, I think,
yeah,
to get some funding, for example, from the local council. Because if you say, we've had this, we've seen the impact, here's the
that's
evidence,
true. Yeah,
then you can leverage that. So I think that that's quite important, is making the space for the books reading and the library in the school, and then you're building this evidence base to ask for money. um, and ultimately, if you don't have money, no problem. Start with digital resources. So Bonnie Norton has done some incredible work with a project started off as African Storybook, but they now have an entire massive website called Storybooks Canada. There's also offshoots called Global Storybooks, Indigenous Storybooks. So essentially, these are digital stories that I believe were commissioned originally for the project and then translated into over, what did she say? I can't remember now if it was over 70 or over 100, quite a few languages. It might have been 170. I don't know. Many languages, right? And you can go immediately to their website. You can click on that book. You can listen to the book. So that also gets around the fact that not everybody is multiliterate. So some of
yeah,
these kids in your school might speak another language, but they might not be able to read and write it. So if they can
yeah,
listen to it, so that's a free way to get going. And the other really cool free way is just to get creative. Make multilingual books with your students. These students
Yeah,
are there. They know how to, some of them know how to read and write a bit. If they don't, then use some dictionaries, right? There's no reason why you can't, these days we have translators, we have whatever, or maybe they could work on it at home with their family. So that you
yeah,
can then bring the kids' stories in their own languages into that space. And of course, you can combine all of these things as well, right? Digital
yeah,
resource, books and creating books as well. So that's, I think, how I might respond to the finances
yeah.
struggle. Yeah.
If
Uh,
you if you send me the link of this website of digital stories, that
yeah,
would be great. I can
absolutely.
add it to the description.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I will do that. It's not the only one as well. So I have shared with you a link and I will make sure that you still have it. I've created a Padlet, which is essentially just a place where
Ah,
you can collect a bunch of links together. And
yeah,
inside that Padlet, you can all add places that you are familiar with. So it might be a publisher. For example, I just recently added a publisher that does Arabic books, but in the UK. So they have a sister company somewhere else. But if you're in the UK, you can order directly from the UK version of their site. So, for example, that's a really great resource as well. So I'll make sure that you have the link both to Storybooks Canada and also to this Padlet. And we'd love for everybody to add to it. Um, what else? There's always a question about sourcing books as a bit of a challenge, right? So actually
yeah,
accessing the resources.
yeah.
Um,
Which one is something that's going to enthuse my students rather than, yeah,
Yes, exactly. So in terms of actually getting them, I'd say that that's a bit of a challenge, really, right? In terms of the actual, logistics behind sourcing them, it takes a bit of research to locate them, takes a bit
yeah,
of money to do international shipping. And the other thing you might encounter, which is a bigger challenge that we can work on into the future, is that some languages are less represented, full stop,
yeah,
right? So there are languages that are not that there are not a lot of picture books in any way or children's books being there aren't a lot of books being published for
yeah,
children in certain languages. So that can be an extra challenge that I think is something that we can think about working towards in the future. But the
yeah,
more that we plant the seeds of multilingual libraries, the more demand that there is then for
yeah,
that kind of representation.
yeah.
But
One step at a time.
one step at a time, yeah. But you
Yeah,
mentioned this really important idea about what children will actually enjoy, right?
yeah,
And as I say, you're going to tell us a bit about, I'm sure, what you've done with your children. But I think from my position, I think you need to give children choices and you need to give them autonomy, right? So
yeah,
let the children's interests guide them and let their interests guide you.
yeah,
So ask them, right? These are people. Ask them what they would like to see. Ask them what types of things that they would like to have in the library. And I think maybe most importantly, perhaps most importantly, would be avoid, dictating which books they should read or borrow or in which languages. Because so, for example, in our multilingual story time, if we had a student who happened to speak Gujarati, that's fine. When I invited them to come pick a book to read with their partner or with their volunteer or with their group, I didn't say, go pick a book in the language that you speak at home, right?
yeah. Because that's
No,
limiting.
that's so limiting, right?
Yeah,
They're going to be exposed to other languages and cultures by reading books in any language. And one of the reasons that we've focused on picture books is that you don't actually need to be able to read the language, right?
yeah,
Many of the kids, and I would extend this actually, when it comes to heritage languages, it's not just kids, it's also teenagers, it's also adults who can't necessarily read in their first language. And that
yeah,
can be demotivating, right? So
yeah,
instead, I think, having a book like a picture book, and actually this book I pulled out because this book's actually a wordless picture book. So we have quite a
yeah,
few wordless picture books in our collection. And I'll just show you the inside because there's just some gorgeous pictures. But essentially, this is a book that you can read, with somebody else,
yeah.
where you can tell the story. It's your
In
story to
any
tell
language. Yeah,
in any language and with any proficiency. And I think that that's really key because we don't want children or anybody to be discouraged, right?
yeah,
We don't want, it's challenging to read in our second language, our third or fourth language. I give up much of the time when I sit down to read in French or Spanish. I can do it, but it takes effort. So we
yeah,
want to try to get rid of those barriers, right? And I think one of the other ways to do that is to create community around reading. So the other idea behind the library of picture books is that we read together. We read stories
Yeah.
aloud. We read with a group. We read with a friend. Well,
Mm.
sometimes we read by ourselves as well. Maybe we read with our parents, right? So that if you can't, for example, read in the case of a different script, right? Maybe you have a Korean speaking child growing up in the UK, but they can't necessarily read Hangul. So in that case, they need somebody. They need that kind of more knowledgeable other, a parent, an older sibling who can help them to sound out,
Yeah.
those letters, and so that they can enjoy the story
Yeah.
without getting caught up on the words that they don't know, I think. So I would say that's it. Give the children the choices, the autonomy, let their interests guide you, and help connect, kids and everybody else with books that they want to read, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one other aspect of picture books that's good, or it's the same for comic books as well, because you can see the images, is so especially when we're school and we want to get books in languages we don't know, is that with the images we can understand roughly if it's
Yes.
going to be appropriate for the age group or we
Yes.
have and the content, even if we don't understand the details, we can
Yeah.
get like maybe 80% correct, 90% correct just by looking at the images.
Yeah, that's perfectly to this idea of, I guess, what's appropriate, right?
Yeah,
Because that is very true. And one of the ways that I have felt comfortable sometimes to pick books out and purchase a book, I can't read this one's dual language actually, so that helps. Sometimes you get a dual language book and then you can fully understand the story. But if you can't, then you flip to the book and you get a sense of the feel of the story. And I think that that's very helpful for determining whether a book is appropriate for your context. So
yeah,
when it comes to appropriateness, I think, first of all, it's very subjective and very context dependent. As a parent, you are free to make those choices that align with your family ethos, which is great.
yeah,
Actually, in that case, as a parent, I think it's almost easier. Well, you can tell me, it's almost easier because you and your partner are perhaps the ones, and maybe your children together are the ones to decide, you know, what is it that works in our family, right? But in a
yeah,
school context, you have a lot of various stakeholders, right? Like you say, we need books that the kids actually are interested in reading. But parents have opinions about what they want their kids to be exposed to. Schools have rules sometimes.
yeah,
So I think that's really something that you have to take into account, right? What's kind of
yeah,
going to work in that context. So some general considerations, though. So you mentioned the idea of the picture book, where it's a little bit easier if you don't speak the language to kind of flip through and get a sense of what it's about. I mean, it's way easier than a novel. A novel, you're gonna be lost. You're not
yeah,
gonna have any idea. But one aspect of what's appropriate is to do with the level of language, right? So if you're teaching at a secondary school, for example, then you're going to be looking for something that has the right level of language.
yeah,
However, keeping in mind that these kids might not be at the same level in their heritage language
yeah,
literacy wise as they are in English, for example, if they've been schooled here.
yeah,
So that can be kind of challenging. In terms of what's appropriate content wise, again, very very subjective here, but I think one really important thing is it interesting and engaging, and will they want to read it over and over again? You
yeah,
know, this is the kind of book that we want to put in front of everyone, because then they're going to be getting the language because they want to read the story.
yeah,
So if you've ever read a story where you were really sucked in, you didn't stop and go, "Oh, I don't know this vocabulary word. I feel frustrated. I give up." You didn't care. You wanted to know what the story is going to tell you, right?
yeah,
So I think in that sense that has to be prioritized. But there's kind of interesting conversations to have around values, and this is where we can maybe get a little bit potentially controversial. I think I started thinking about this. My colleague, Dr. Nashia Mohammed, she presented research this summer and talking about the Maldives context and the language Divehi, and looking at the picture books that have been created in this language. So it's quite new that they're creating books in this language. And one of the themes that emerged from her research was that quite a few of these books had topics related to religion, right? So it's a Muslim nation, and therefore
yeah,
religion is deeply intertwined with culture.
yeah,
And it often is. So I wanted to buy a book in Burmese, and it was the same thing. It's a book it's about Burma, but it's Myanmar now, I guess. But it's also about Buddhism, right? Because it's intertwined with the culture. But this
Yeah,
is a question that that you might kind of ask yourselves. In some countries, there's a bit more freedom as to what types of books you can put in a public school library. In others, there's a challenge,
yeah,
right? But
that's true. Yeah,
I think, yeah, how controversial are you allowed to be, but also how controversial do you want to be? In my
yeah,
opinion, you could include any book, but I think that some books, for example, if you're going to bring in a book with religious connotations, right? That might be actually a very interesting book to have as a class discussion, right? So that
yeah,
that way that you have some back and forth and it's not just kind of plunked out there, for
yeah,
kids to interpret as they will.
yeah,
So yeah, I'm not sure if you want to tell your story about about appropriateness in the
yeah. I think
in the
you're referring to what I told you last time.
yes,
It's
yes.
when I was in France with my sons. We were at a bookshop and we were a bit in a hurry, so I told them like take, I don't know, 3 books each or whatever. And so they looked through the pages and then so I want this. And I looked through them. I thought, yeah, it looks fine. And we went, and when we arrived home, I started reading one of them. It was like something about how do you call it? Like magic and trolls and all that universe. So fantastic. Um, and and what I didn't realize just by flicking through the pages that it was actually meant for like maybe teenagers. So there were, or maybe adults, but there were loads of swear words inside. And I stopped and I thought, do I really want them to know all these words? And so I explained it to my sons. Obviously, they were interested,
Yes.
but then I thought, okay, when they are going back to France, I'd rather them understand swear words without using them, but understand them.
Mhm.
So then I think I read it, but I said, I don't want you to use these words. And so we talked about what was allowed, what was a big swear word, a small one.
Yes.
And yeah, but in the end, so we kept it. It's in the library. We don't read it often, but
Mhm.
it's there. But I think yeah, like you said, as a family, we can make these decisions really easily because it's just us.
Mhm.
As a school, you have so many people involved that it's longer maybe to take a decision, and you have to be more cautious about what you allow inside your library.
Yeah, I love this idea though about the book kind of facilitating this wider conversation and discussion because, had you said to the kids, no, you can't have this book, it's not appropriate for you, they would have been sneaking it, when you weren't home,
Yeah, probably.
it's precisely by saying no, rather than having that conversation. But you're right that in a more public context, in a public school context, then we have more kind of stakeholders to think about.
Yeah,
Um, I think it's about also just accepting that sometimes you might get something a bit wrong. I don't know. Maybe if you
yeah,
put a book into the library, and somebody says, "Oh, I noticed in this book this is this kind of content," and you go, "Oh, okay, well maybe I'll take that one out. I'll put a little
yeah,
label on it, and then maybe, like we said, maybe it might be a good one to facilitate a discussion that was led by a teacher, because I
yeah,
think that that's maybe the difference is which books the kids or whatever age you're dealing with can kind of freely take from and kind of interpret
yeah,
on their own, and which ones actually could benefit from a kind of wider conversation with an adult, for example.
yeah,
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think some other possible challenges, I think those are maybe some of the big ones, but in the UK and probably more widely, there's a lack of libraries and librarians in public
um,
schools in general. So the question of kind of who is going to take on this role? I mean, it's not a small
yeah,
job to
yeah,
keep a library updated, to get books put into a system where kids and people
yeah,
can borrow them. So, for example, currently our library is not check-outable. So we are continuing to do kind of this multilingual library pop-up event for people to engage with our books, or we'd like to continue, partnering with schools to do this multilingual story time, but we just don't have the infrastructure for people to borrow the books, right? So if you don't have a library and a librarian to kind of, then you're going to lose those books, right? Because people love the books and they sometimes take them and don't bring them back, right? So these are things I think that are really important, actually, is not just to highlight the need for representation in our libraries, but we actually need libraries and we need experts who are in
Yeah.
charge of them. So that's a wider challenge that I don't think we can solve today, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I think we can also think about some other things like our own agendas, right? The kind of Western biases that we might be seeing. So, for example, it's easier to buy translated text, right? I mentioned the Julia Donaldson ones. You can actually find
Yeah.
quite a few used books in, you name it, whatever language under the sun. But when you have a translated text, you're also, translating that content. So we're still telling stories that are from our own perspective or from this culture's dominant kind of culture's perspective, So there's a lot of value, I think, in trying to go out there and try to find stories that are being told by people with other languages, with
Mm.
other cultures, so that, not to say don't put translated books in your library. Yes, put all the kind of books in
Yeah.
your library, but let's see if we can also kind of elevate some minoritized voices, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Maybe to finish, is
Sure.
there anything you would like to teachers or people working in schools to take away from this discussion? Maybe one thing you think this is really key for everyone to understand?
Yeah, and you had told me this idea of one thing, but I'm gonna just put a couple, just quick
Yeah,
ones.
that's fine. Yeah,
That's okay. So, first, I think a really key message is that developing a multilingual library can be relatively simple and cheap-ish, right? So I think
yeah,
this idea that something is better than nothing, mobilizing digital resources, creating multilingual materials with your students, that is a free way to go about it. So it doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be expensive. Second is really work collaboratively, right? We can overcome some of these challenges with accessing resources, with knowing if the content is appropriate, etc., by talking to each other, by asking for help, by talking to your, friends that are parenting in another language or teachers that have
yeah,
a different demographic in their school. What books do you have in your school? One thing I hope to do
yeah.
eventually is to make our collection, make our catalog available so that people, who just go, oh, I don't know where to start, but here's a list of books that they have in their multilingual library that I might want to get some of those. Like, oh, we could use one in Arabic. That one sounds interesting. I'll see if I can order it.
That's
So
true.
I
Yeah,
think, yeah, work collaboratively. And then really key is just that representation matters, right?
yeah,
So where and when are languages being made visible in your context? And what kind of message is that sending? So I
yeah,
think at the end of the day, my plug is also just for picture books because I think that picture books are for everyone. So whether you
yeah,
can read the words on the page or not, whether you have really highly developed literacy in your, heritage language or not, you can tell and share a story in any language using any kind of linguistic resources that you have. And doing this, reading together in community, can also help overcome these types of challenges with literacy levels. So get your teachers and parents and siblings and community members involved, right? Make it fun, I think.
yeah. And yeah, if you give me the link to the Padlet you were talking about earlier, I think that's also a good place to start. So if we don't know where to find these books or what books to get, I guess that would be really helpful.
Absolutely. And obviously I think it's obvious. I quite enjoyed chatting about this kind of thing. So if you are wanting to get started and you want to grab a coffee, have a Zoom and a chat, just reach out because it's really important to, yeah, to talk to other people and that way we're not all reinventing the wheel. There are a lot of other great scholars working on these types of things. So let's
Yeah,
share resources together.
yeah. And for those of you who would like to get in touch with Hannah, sorry, you have the links in the not the links, the details in the description of your Twitter and other things. So you can reach out to Hannah to discuss multilingual libraries. Thank you very much again for being here and for discussing this very interesting topic. And so in about 15, 20 minutes, we'll be back with another session, which will be with Dr. Nair Correa Ibrahim to talk about multilingual literacy and identity. So it's a topic that promises to be very interesting. So if that triggers your curiosity, come along and join us. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you very much, Hannah, again.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.